Okay, good morning and good afternoon, whatever the case may be, depending on where you are and which part of the world, and perhaps good evening in many of the countries from where you are joining us this for this zoominar. At the outset, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from where we are hosting this zoominar, and I pay my respect to the elders, past and present and emerging. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Institute for Australia-India Engagement, Australia-India Business Council, and the Center for India-Australia Studies at the Jindal Global University in India, it is an honor and privilege to welcome you all in this inaugural zoominar, as we call it, to discuss an inaugural virtual summit, a historical virtual summit which took place yesterday. And I'm pleased to share that we have got today guests from India, Australia, Singapore, Japan, United States, New Zealand, United Kingdom, in many other countries for this important discussion. But before we go forward, please allow me to spell out a couple of housekeeping things. First is please put your comments and questions at the end of the discussion in the chat box, and kindly identify yourself when you are putting those questions and comments. And please keep your microphone on mute to prevent any disturbances from interrupting the meeting. We are also very thankful today to AI Media for providing the live caption for this discussion. We are trying to work that out at the moment, so there's a bit of technical glitch here and there, but we are working on it. But at the very outset, ladies and gentlemen, please allow us to welcome a very distinguished panel today, which consists of Ambassador Anil Wadhwa from India, Ms. Melissa Conley Tyler from AsiaLink in Melbourne. We have got Mr. Jim Varghese, AM, here from Brisbane. We have got Professor Purnendra Jain from Adelaide, and we have got Mr. Shaun, who's the director of Center for India-Australia Studies at Jindal Global University. So this meeting is laying the foundation of what we call the Triveni Dialogue Series. Triveni, as some of you may know, in India, is a place where three rivers meet. It's the tri-junction of three rivers. The three institutions have come together: Institute for Australia-India Engagement, Australia-India Business Council, and the Center for India-Australia Studies at Jindal Global University. And that gives birth to this Triveni Dialogue Series, and this is the first of many, I'm sure, to come. Ladies and gentlemen, as High Commissioner of Australia and India, Barry O'Farrell described that India-Australia relations are at a historic high. And this is why we are very privileged to welcome you all to discuss this matter at such an important stage in our bilateral relationship. Many of you must have attended the zoominar or the virtual summit between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Scott Morrison. And one could feel the warmth and comfort in their exchange, starting from Namaste from Scott Morrison to the reference to hologram technology, samosa, and ending with Gujarati khichdi. So you could feel that warmth in their exchange. And Scott Morrison referring to Prime Minister Modi as Narendra and talking about personal invite. And Prime Minister Modi's own tone and tenor in terms of talking about the way Australia is taking care of Indian diaspora and the students. So you could see that warmth in the relationship. There's something new about this relationship. And about Australia, I can say that in Prime Minister Scott Morrison remarked, the reference to Indonesia and Japan also was very significant. I'm sure Professor Jain, who's a Japan expert, would have taken notice of that. And the joint statement, some of you must have seen it, covers a wide area of issues, from defense to cybersecurity, mining, minerals, vocational education, water resources, terrorism, people-to-people business, trade. The scope is vast. So today, I must say that Australia and the relationship are at the cusp of turning a new leaf in their cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. But before we go forward, it will be only worthwhile and important to flag that this stage has not come in a day. We are not at this point in a matter of weeks or months. It has been a very extraordinary journey for the bilateral relationship and the strategic partnership. And over the years and decades, there have been leaders like John Howard, you had Julia Gillard, you had Malcolm Turnbull, you had Tony Abbott, and now Scott Morrison played such an important role. From India, we had Prime Minister Modi, and now Prime Minister Narendra Modi playing such a stellar role in boosting this partnership. And we have today Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, who was also Secretary East. So he must have had a very important role to play in these years and months. So over the years, there have been so much happening. Australia's role in getting the NSG waiver for India, the use of the allure of culture by both sides, tweeting in Hindi, and then increasing mutual understanding through the Peter Varghese report and also through Ambassador Anil Wadhwa's complimentary report. Australia's support to India in terrorism, Indian players coming to Australia to play in the bushfire cricket match, Australia helping India in Bihar by providing beds and specialized beds and a whole lot of other medical aid, the role of Indian diaspora, and above all, the young ambassadors from Australia who go to India under the New Colombo plan. And of course, our cricketers. So we have all these people who over the years have played a fantastic role in boosting this relationship, which is now has reached this historic point. So ladies and gentlemen, to discuss some of those and also the significance and impact of the partnership, I'll please allow me to welcome our very first speaker, which is Ambassador Anil Wadhwa. Ambassador Anil Wadhwa had a 37-year-long distinguished career with the Indian Foreign Service. Ambassador Wadhwa has been posted in Italy and San Marino, Thailand, Oman, Poland, Lithuania, and has also served in Hong Kong and Beijing twice. He has been at the permanent mission of India in Geneva and on a deputation at The Hague. He was also the head of East European Division, and he was Secretary East at the Ministry of External Affairs, and has engaged with ASEAN and Southeast Asia, Australia and New Zealand, the Pacific, the Gulf Cooperation Council, Middle East and West Asia. He led India in Geneva, New York, and the ASEAN, ASEM, ADMM, and small island meetings in the Indo-Pacific. Ambassador Wadhwa is also a very prolific writer and author, and he has written the Complementary Australia Strategy, which soon we'll be actioning upon. He's fluent in Chinese and knows French. And also he has his better half, Ambassador Deepa Gopalan Wadhwa, is also a diplomat. So you can imagine, a typical conversation around that dining table would be nothing but pure masterclass on foreign policy. So welcome so much, sir. And it's a delight and honor to welcome you today to discuss what is the impact of this virtual summit. What are the key takeaways for you, sir? Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ashutosh, for that generous introduction. Good morning from New Delhi and good afternoon to everybody in Australia. Let me begin by saying that this virtual panel, Modi and Morrison, was no doubt very great in optics, and many see it also as an unqualified success. This year, as you said, was on trust and camaraderie, but it also had a lot of substance. And the 2009 bilateral strategy we have with Australia has now been elevated to a comprehensive strategic part, existing 2+2 dialogue between the foreign and defense secretaries to the ministerial level. So what happens is that this brings it on par with the United States and Japan and other members of the quadrilateral grouping. There's a joint declaration on shared vision for maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, which all of us have seen. And that's a roadmap that has been announced in the Indo-Pacific region, along with extended linkages between the maritime agencies to harness opportunities, strategic partners. We know that there were 7 concrete MOUs that were much agreed, agreed upon. And there was a much awaited mutual logistics support arrangement, which has been signed, which will allow use of each other's facilities and also increase military interoperability through defense exercises. And by the way, India has similar agreements with the United States, France, Singapore, and South Korea. Both sides have also agreed to deepen and broaden the defense cooperation by enhancing the scope and complexity of their military exercises to address what we see as shared security challenges. So what will happen is that both countries will now be able to enjoy the resources of the other in the Indian and the Pacific Oceans interchangeably. And this, along with the enhanced maritime domain awareness, will greatly enhance their capabilities and capacities. Then we come to the implementing arrangement concerning cooperation in defense, science and technology. This is an adjunct to the MOU on defense cooperation, which already exists. And that provides a framework for growing collaboration and technology research between the two concerned organizations of the two countries. There are many areas which have already been identified for such collaboration, and that includes things like advanced sensors, underwater technologies, quantum computing and cryptography, laser technologies, hypersonic and technologies, and also technology cooperation and shipbuilding between Indian shipyards and Australian shipbuilding industry. Prime Minister believed during the discussions, and this we came to know in the briefings after the virtual summit, also conveyed that India is working on its Mars and Moon missions, and Australia can work in India in that collaboration. Then there is the framework arrangement which has been reached on cyber and cyber-enabled critical technology cooperation. That is also, I believe, an expected outcome because we've seen a rise in connectivity, in digital transactions, in volume and nature of personal data, and that has increased the vulnerability in Australia as well as in India to cyber crimes. And both countries see the need for stricter cyber security measures. So a framework for operational collaboration on cybersecurity between the two countries, I must point out, already exists. But Australia's telecommunications sector reform and Australia's approach to 5G has evoked a lot of interest in India, and I think that was a trigger for arriving at this arrangement. Uh, Next, I'd like to talk about critical minerals. Now here, Australia has reserves of 21 out of the 49 minerals that have been identified in the Indian critical mineral strategy. And many rare earths are required in manufacturing processes of electric motors and lithium-ion batteries, magnets, other end-use products as well for India's e-mobility program. So both sides, what they've done is they've agreed to diversify and expand the existing resources partnership. And hopefully Australia will also collaborate with India to process rare earth minerals at Indian locations. Three of them have been identified, by the way, by the Niti Aayog in India, the equivalent to our planning commission. And the MOU and cooperation in the field of mining and processing of critical and strategic minerals, in my view, will ensure a long-standing supply and investment relationship between the two countries in the areas of critical minerals. This will also ensure that the two countries collaborate on new technologies for exploration and extraction of minerals. We also have an MOU on cooperation in the field of public administration and governance reform. I think this is a vote of confidence in the way things are run in Australia. India and Australia both have accountable public institutions, but India would like to exchange knowledge on timely reforms and methodology. So in future, I see that this could extend also into the area of training and cooperation and processes. The MOU on vocational education and training also was very much on the cards, and India's large and young population and the target that we have of training 400 million people by 2022 has actually thrown up a lot of opportunities for the Australian vocational education system. And the collaboration with Australian agencies can be extended across enhancement of training curriculum, aligning Indian accreditation and assessment to global standards, improving trainer quality, and conducting joint training workshops. There's a lot of scope there. Then there's a new collaborative arrangement on water resources management, training and education, and for developing sustainable solutions for water and economic development, also water recycling. I believe this will also be a beneficial area of cooperation for both sides. Finally, I must mention the Australia-India Scientific Research Fund, which is a reserve fund, which has been an example of a very successful research fund set up, way back in 2004. And that has been funding a number of successful projects in the areas of life sciences, in biotechnology, in genetics, etc. So what's happened after the COVID-19 pandemic is that it's highlighted the need for both countries to strengthen their research and development exchange, and also to provide support for the health sector in both countries. In April 2020, just a few weeks ago, in fact, the Griffith University in Australia, and then in Hyderabad, we have the Indian Immunological Limited. They have already started work on developing a vaccine for the novel coronavirus. And they've also agreed through the joint statement, which I saw, to have a one-off special COVID-19 collaboration round based on this scientific reserve fund in 2020. There are discussions on mutual collaborations on circular economy, which went on during this virtual summit. Also on surface coal gasification, waste to wealth management, and also in diagnostics. All of these are welcome discussions because they open up new areas of collaboration. And I think the flagging of the need to strengthen India-Australia partnership on grain management and logistics to reduce post-harvest losses, rationalize costs, also supply chain logistics, and the move to set up educational campuses in each other's countries. They're all very welcome steps. From the briefings after the event in the evening, it emerged that the requirement of Australian pension funds to be kept engaged in India's infrastructure development requirements, the need for cutting out funding for terrorism. Then the cultural symphonies that exist between the two countries were also discussed. All of them are very good points. Now, for a few things unsaid but explicit in the declarations, I thought, and the MOUs. The reiteration of a common approach to free, open, inclusive, and prosperous Indo-Pacific, which guarantees the freedom of navigation and overflights in the interest of unimpeded commerce. And also the new rules-based order in particular. I think it's come about in the backdrop of aggressive Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, in the Western Pacific, and in China's behavior with ASEAN countries like Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia, as well as Taiwan and Japan. And India is currently, as we speak, facing transgressions at multiple points from China on the Indo-Chinese border. Australia is facing return pressure in trade through enhanced tariffs and anti-dumping measures for support of an independent assessment on the origins of the novel coronavirus. China has also made some very aggressive forays in the South Pacific, and there's been talk of China seeking bases in places like Vanuatu and Solomon Islands. So the joint statements don't spell this out, but I think the fact that they express support for cooperation in multilateral fora, for the centrality of ASEAN, for India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, for the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, and for peaceful resolution of disputes rather than through unilateral and coercive actions. I think they all point to the direction that I just talked about. The COVID-19 consultations in the framework of the Quad Plus, then the Quad itself, the trilateral meetings with Japan and Indonesia, they've all found support in the joint declaration. And there is a move, and I'm very glad that there is, to finally exchange views on Australia's Pacific setup and India's Forum for India-Pacific Islands Cooperation, which is called FIPIC. The current global situation, in fact, has made countries rethink their strategy on the location of supply chains. And I think Australian big businesses must look at diversification and the advantages and opportunities that the Indian market can offer to them. What more could have been done? For one, besides discussing challenges in the new global scenario, I think both sides could have looked at more concrete ways in which the bilateral economic engagement could have been taken forward. And India and Australia bilateral negotiations of the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, SECA, which is a good development. I would have very much liked to see a mention of the Australia Economic Strategy Report, which, as you mentioned, I've been working on along with CII team over the past many months in the joint statement. But that is still awaiting final approval and hopefully will be taken forward through another virtual event in the future when officials and industry from both sides could participate and look at the concrete recommendations in 20 different areas which have been identified. I believe Australian businesses will benefit a lot from opportunities in and market that India offers for scaling up technologies, and that is across a whole range of agri-tech, med-tech, health tech, education technologies, water technologies, even in chip building and startups. And I should not use this phrase, I hesitate to use it, but I would say that a win-win situation can develop for both in digital gaming and animation, in textile designing, in sports technologies and equipment, in renewable energy and power, in food processing, in dairy technologies, healthcare, clinical trials, and pharmaceuticals. There's a whole range of areas. And I'm convinced, Ashutosh, like the two prime ministers, that the 700 strong Indian diaspora in Australia, I think close to now 110,000 students studying in the country, will drive this relationship forward. And in this context, the desire of Prime Minister Morrison to encourage more Australian students to study in India under the new Colombo plan will only reinforce this trend. The Australia-India Youth Dialogue has been identified by Prime Minister Morrison as a driver for conducting a hackathon between the universities of the two countries. This conversation also took place during the virtual summit. So that's a good development as well. Let me end by saying that this virtual summit has shown that the interests of India and Australia have rapidly converged on a growing bilateral, regional, and multilateral agenda. Collaborations between the two countries has been strengthened through the personal chemistry between the two prime ministers. There's a support for the informal grouping of the Quad, the shared vision of the Indo-Pacific. There are common values of democracy, rule of law. And so, in my view, Australia is an ideal strategic partner for India as it moves on its journey to achieve adequately high growth for its large and growing population, and also for meeting the challenges of rapid urbanization, of infrastructure, development of water resources that we face. Australian natural resources, technology, high-end manufacturing, all require a market like India. And as I wrote in an article on the eve of the virtual summit, resources, technology, and services, and research and innovation, these are the three drivers of the future India-Australia relationship. I think a potentially very strong relationship, Ashutosh, whose time has now come. Thank you. I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Wadhwa, for your very lucid and very succinct summary of what has happened yesterday. It's a huge document, the bilateral joint statement that has come, and the scope is enormous, and it will be interesting to look into the unwritten things as you hinted at, which are there in the document. So with this, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me now to welcome our second speaker, Ms. Melissa Conley-Tyler. Melissa is the director of AsiaLink Diplomacy at the University of Melbourne. Prior to that, she was National Executive Director of the Australia-India Institute of International Affairs for 13 years. During her leadership, AII was recognized as the top think tank in Southeast and the Pacific, and one of the top 50 think tanks worldwide, which was revealed in the University of Pennsylvania's Global Go-To Think Tank Index for 3 years in a running. She has delivered over 40 dialogues at Australian Institute of International Affairs, established sustaining networks among Australian international leaders, tracked 2 dialogues. She has led delegations and brought academics and government officials together. She's a lawyer and specialist in conflict resolution, including negotiation, mediation, peace, and education. She was also program manager for International Conflict Resolution Center at the University of Melbourne. In 2017, she's authored The Think Tank Diplomacy, a very incisive book. First ever book-length discussion on the role of think tanks in modern diplomacy. In 2019, she was honored as Fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs in recognition of her distinguished contribution to international affairs. She has done a lot of work on perceptions, and I'm sure she will share some of it. How does she and how does perception-wise the virtual summit and overall strategic partnership look from her end? Melissa, all yours.
So as Ashutosh said in his very kind introduction, I'm the Director of Diplomacy at AsiaLink at the University of Melbourne. And I think this virtual summit will be remembered for the skimosas. So if you haven't been following social media, Prime Minister Scott Morrison during the week posted a wonderful picture of some homemade samosas that he had made and that he wished he could share in person with Prime Minister Modi. And I have to say, that's not a criticism from me. I think skimosas is exactly the right time, because part of the point of summits is signalling. It's all about giving that sense of warmth and connection. So when the Australians' headline on the summit is trusted friends, you know you've done well. And as Ashutosh says, you know, there's that real warmth that's important. As Ambassador Wadhwa says, there's that personal chemistry. You want to use that. Okay. So when I say the major results of the summit are symbolic, again, I don't mean it's not significant. The biggest announcement that Australia and India have now elevated their relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership, that is a very important symbol. Australia only has 3 other at comprehensive strategic partnership level, and it's the highest level below formal treaty allies. It's the highest level you can have in a relationship. And so the decision to elevate the relationship to that level, that's a big one. So in terms of the specific agreements that Ambassador Wadhwa has taken us through, I mean, I think, again, none of those are surprising. Cyber cooperation, maritime cooperation, critical minerals, defence logistics, they're a continuation of a very positive relationship we already have. So the next step in engagement in a lot of areas where we've been doing work already, and having a summit is a point where you can say, oh, look, we have an announceable. This thing that we've been working on, we've got it to a point where we can announce it and have something to say. I think what I found really impressive about this summit is honestly just the fact it happened. Okay, I was in India in January for the Triveni Dialogue, where Prime Minister Morrison was supposed to come, but with the Australian bushfires, he did not. I think it's astonishing that in the midst of COVID-19, that these 2 prime ministers have made time to meet with each other. So, you know, this week, for example, Australia had our forecast of our worst growth figures in our entire history. That's how bad our economy is looking, just to mention. For India, I think the growth figures are looking like the worst in 11 years, something like that. So at this time of crisis, who you choose to spend time with matters. It sends a really serious message. And the message that came from this is that message of mutual solidarity, you know, a reaffirmation of the mutual importance of the relationship as they both see it. And as part of that, continuing deepening of areas of engagement that we already have. I thought, particularly in the context of COVID, one of the really important announcements was the next phase for the Australia-India Strategic Research Fund. So this is a fund that enables joint research between Australia and India. And from Australia's perspective, it's the biggest fund we have with any country for scientific cooperation. And the fact it's been called upon to stand up and encourage cooperation with this, COVID crisis, I think is, again, an important message. On the messaging side, I suppose I saw the biggest risk of the summit would be that it would be exclusively seen through the prism of relationships with China. The domestic debate in Australia at the moment is very focused on that issue. It's very focused on diversifying from China. And at least from my perspective, I don't want India to be seen through that lens. It's an immensely important relationship between Australia and India in itself. And that's what I think one should be focusing on. So I liked the fact that the messaging around this was very much about Australia and India's very warm and friendly relations in the Ministry for External Affairs press release, for example. There was a bit of the positioning around, is this about China in the media reporting? But I thought the leaders themselves were very careful in the language they used. So you talk about Australia and India's comprehensive strategic partnership being based on mutual understanding, trust, common interest, and shared values of democracy and rule of law, for example. Or you talk about the joint commitment to global cooperation. Or in one that I think Australia would be very pleased with, getting India to sign off on working together to strengthen international institutions to be inclusive and rules-based. Okay, again, that's language that says we have common interests in the world, we want to work together. It's not directed at anyone, and I think that's exactly how it should be presented. I have to say, for me, probably the biggest surprise in this was the announcement that Australia and India will re-engage on the bilateral trade deal on CECA, which was abandoned a few years ago because of lack of progress. Now, I'd known that there was interest on the Indian side. I know the previous High Commissioner in Australia, for example, was very clear on wanting to restart, but I didn't realise that there was that much momentum behind it. I remain one of the people who's probably not massively optimistic that that's going to lead to, a sudden great trade deal. But the fact that the talks are happening is interesting in itself. That we don't want to shelve it, we at least want to explore it. That's a little bit more than we had. From my perspective, I see the economic sphere as where the lack of depth in the relationship is. Yes, it's growing. We have 21 billion in trade, but there's a lot of room for more growth. Australia's India economic strategy provides a framework for that, for trying to greatly increase the economic engagement. And essentially it just needs to be implemented. We need to double down on the economic engagement. And in many cases, what we need is Australian businesses to feel more comfortable investing in India, which takes time. It's not something that happens overnight. So at AsiaLink, in AsiaLink Business, we're working very closely with various sectors and a number of people on this call, if I might say, on trying to implement Australia's India economic strategy in the different sectors where that growth is possible. I had been hoping that we might be seeing India's Australia economic strategy coming out, and Ambassador Wadhwa, I'm sorry to hear it's still in the approvals process. I don't know if in questions you're able to reveal or divulge anything to us about what that looks like and when that might get approved. And I'm also looking forward to a business perspective from Jim Varghese on where he sees the opportunities from what we've seen in the virtual summit. To finish up, I suppose I just want to say a little bit about the idea of a virtual summit. So one of my areas is the practice of diplomacy. How do you do diplomacy? And I've been researching how diplomats have changed their practice in response to COVID-19. What I thought was really interesting here was seeing how well this could be adapted. So, virtual summits are very new for leaders. And a lot of them, I think, would be very resistant to it. Diplomacy is a famously face-to-face, people-to-people sort of profession. And the idea that you can do these things virtually and they can still be worthwhile, I think is new. But I think it's a very promising sign that these things are happening. I think what this summit showed is that there's a lot of advantages to a virtual summit. It's easier to schedule. It takes a lot less of leaders' time. And what I think Prime Ministers Modi and Morrison showed is you can convey a real warmth, a real genuine personal warmth in it. Pretty much the only thing you can't do is eat the samosas. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Melissa. This time I did not unmute my mic at all. I was a bit scared this time, so that we don't have another technical glitch impeding our, which is turning out to be a very fascinating discussion with you all. Fantastic and very, very, I think, thought-provoking perspective from Melissa, and I think from some of our Indian participants, it is always very revealing and interesting to get an Australian perspective from an Australian from Australia about Australia and our relationship. And I think that is what Melissa has done in a very nuanced fashion. Thank you so very much. And you and both you and Ambassador Wadhwa have hinted at the Australia-India economic relationship and why there is so much of scope. And the both leaders also hinted that they wanted to go much higher, and it's not still achieving its full potential. So I think to talk about it, we would have, we have, the best person at the moment in Brisbane with us, and that is Mr. Jim Varghese. Mr. Jim Varghese, he is the national chair for the Australia-India Business Council, and he brings with him the decades of leadership experiences in running multifaceted businesses here in Australia for many decades. He's also chairman and owner of the leadership company Queensland Proprietary Limited and director of Springfield Land Corporation. Jim possesses 30 years of experience as chief executive in leading government agencies covering transport, main roads, education, training, employment, and primary industries, both in Victoria and Queensland public sector. He represented public and private sector in significant trade missions and forums in China and Middle East, United Kingdom, United States, Malaysia, Indonesia, and India. Jim is also the chair of Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Committee that delivered the Mahatma Gandhi statue in Brisbane and the Mahatma Gandhi Inspiration Bridge in Springfield here in Brisbane, which was unveiled by Prime Minister Narendra Modi during G20. Jim is also the award-winning creator of 3 learning frames management approach, and he was awarded the Centenary Medal for Services to the Public Sector, and in 2009 was awarded Order of Australia for Services to Public Sector Reform. He has got a very tall CV, and it goes on and on and on. So let me invite him now to share his perspectives on what is a very important aspect of bilateral relationship, that is economics. Jim, all yours.
Thank you very much. Can I thank Ambassador Anil and Melissa for the background that they have given, a very good background. Can I just start with saying, we were the Australia-India Business Council. I was just saying, Ashutosh, that I thank Ambassador Anil for his very, very comprehensive outline of the summit. I think it was excellent, and Melissa's comment, a good backdrop. The Australia-India Business Council, formed in 1986, is really about the business-to-business relationships. We have chapters in every state and territory, and we've just undergone a significant reform process by actually focusing our attention on industry sectors. How timely is that in relation to where we are today? So can I just inject a note of realism as we look at this virtual summit? First, I congratulate Prime Minister Modi and our Prime Minister Scott Morrison for a document that is pragmatic and comprehensive. But let us not forget that Australia and India are recovering from COVID-19. We have to resuscitate our economies. It is not business as usual. We have to work together on the business side to repurpose jobs and business, and effectively to create a new normal. Now, if you take Ambassador Anil's very comprehensive outline, and you look at the Australia-India economic strategy, we still have a target of going from 17 billion in 2018 to 45 billion to 2035. And so when we look at what we have to do, we have a long journey ahead. So let's start positively and then negatively. Tourism and education is in an absolute tailspin because of COVID-19. We have the opportunity now to really lift that up, lift it, plan for it. And in the meantime, we have got resources like coal, mining, agriculture to really stimulate the business. And I'm very confident that in areas like health, India has to really, and I understand having attended the CII panel, would look to doubling its health expenditure from 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP. Now here is an area, as in the agreement that we have with the Prime Minister, that we can contribute a great deal into the supply chain, that we can actually be part of that, and that we have an enormous opportunity also to work through the supply and demand in the manufacturing sector, so that that dependence on agriculture can also shift to manufacturing. And of course, with our super funds and investments in India, we can also accelerate infrastructure expenditure. So when I look at it, I think there's some very encouraging signs that have come out of this for us to work with Australian natural resources, the technology and high-end manufacturing. And I think a practical thing of the mutual support logistics agreement is actually very significant, not just for defense, but also for access to ports and facilities. And as Ambassador Anil pointed out, we have 21 out of the 49 minerals identified by India's critical minerals. Now, that is such an opportunity for us. And again, when we go to life sciences, biotechnology and genetics, and the mention of the vaccination with Griffith University, but not to mention Queensland University that's today readily moving with CSIRO and co to move into that vaccination. We have enormous ability to be able to do it. We've got cutting edge technology in mining, medical, and we have a young population in India, as Ambassador Anil has pointed out, 400 million that we can put into vocational education. So I would say that in looking at the agreement in water resources management, using the increasing connection with our diaspora of about 700,000, and looking at the 110,000 Indian students currently in Australia, we have a really great opportunity. But it has to be, our view, business to business focused. And I'd like to see the Strategic Research Fund also provide some strategic business research. We've put up the submission for an Australia Trade Index, and I'd like to see that take foot. So in summary, this is a great opportunity for both nations to resuscitate their economy in COVID-19. This geostrategic diversification that Australia is looking for makes this very timely. And I'm very confident that despite the dark pole that COVID-19 has brought to all our business in both our countries, there is a clear direction here in this very comprehensive summit.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very, very much for your very, I think, to the point and focused recommendations and your read of what is lacking and what we all need to do from here on. And I think there's a huge lot of work ahead of us. And I think here, Australia India Business Council, along with other institutions here in India, in Australia and in India, you have the work cut out. And I think a good way to start is to see the Australia economic strategy being announced and formally announced, and then we start actioning upon the two reports, the Ambassador Wadhwa report and Peter Varghese report. So I think that would be a wonderful way to go forward from here. Thank you so much for that, Jim, for your fantastic comments today. All right, so we have now Professor Purnendra, as I mentioned, that he has had a very distinguished career as a professor at the University of Adelaide, ladies and gentlemen. And I met him first in 2007. Since then, I've seen he's been a prolific writer, and he's been writing on Australia-Japan relationship and Australia-India relationship. And he's currently also the adjunct professor at the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Adelaide. Professor Jain was recently awarded the Japanese Emperor's Order of the Rising Sun Award, which had the gold rays with Nick ribbon. He was awarded that coveted, distinguished, I think, recognition from the Japanese Emperor. So congratulations, Professor Purnendra, for that. His area of focus has been Japanese politics and foreign policy, and I'm sure he would have something to say about the reference from Scott Morrison for Japan and Prime Minister Abe again and again in his speech. He has co-authored and edited 14 books and numerous research articles, and he has written extensively on Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region, including Japan, India, and Australia-India bilateral relationship. He is also the honorary head of research and academic development at SAGE International Australia, which is an Adelaide-based think tank. It's our profound pleasure to welcome Professor Purnendra to share his perspectives on how he looks at the virtual summit and way forward from here. Professor Purnendra, all yours.
Thanks very much, Ashutosh, for your very kind introduction and generous introduction, and for inviting me to this distinguished panel. You know, you talked about Japan. When I read the joint statement last night, I was very much reminded of joint statements issued between Japan and India over the last 10 years or even more. Such a comprehensive document, I stand to correction by the panel. I haven't seen such an extensive document and joint statement between Australia and Japan in the past. And this tells us about the two nations' understanding of each other and how we have traveled a long distance in the past. There was a bit of neglect on both sides. There was a bit of, even I would call, lack of understanding and also suspicion at times as to what India was about, or from the Indian side, what Australia was about. It seems now Australia and India, they have brought each other on the center of their diplomatic map. And that is, in my view, a huge development in the bilateral relationship. Now, Ambassador Wadhwa and Melissa and Jim Varghese, they have given us a very good background, some comments from kind of practitioner perspective. But I want to bring some points here, which could be some inconvenient points as well. I don't want to repeat what has been said in the joint statement that has been very elegantly presented by Ambassador Wadhwa. But on Melissa's point about Samosa's diplomacy, Prime Minister Scott Morrison also mentioned about khichdi, which is, and he said, oh, he knew that Prime Minister Modi loves khichdi. And khichdi, then Prime Minister Modi said, oh, I love it, but this is a national dish, just not a Gujarati dish. And I thought that was quite interesting because yes, khichdi is a national dish, but it's prepared very differently with different spices around across India. And that tells us the diversity of India and diversity of cuisine, diversity of language, diversity of lots of other stuff, but still khichdi is one. That is the symbolic India, which is one, but there are many kinds of khichdi's in India. I think that was quite interesting. But the point I want to make very quickly is, yes, we have seen 49 points and 9 agreements and pacts, and they're very important. But my question is, what is really driving Australia-India relations? We talk about shared values, we talk about democracy, we talk about rule of law. Even India has been practicing democracy for the last 60, 70 years. So has been Australia. There has been rule of law in India, in Australia. So are these the drivers of the current development in the relationship, or are there other kinds of drivers? I think that's a very important question we must ask ourselves. Is it about business? Is it about trade? Is it about commerce? Or is it about real politics, which is a strategy, defense, security? Maybe we can argue that maybe it's a combination of everything, but the point I want to make here is that it seems to me that real politics is driving the relationship in a big way, and with that package comes the economy, trade, shared values and other ideas. So that's the point I wanted to make, but we can have a discussion on that point. The other point I wanted to make is about what's the roadmap? How do we go about these things? It's all right, prime ministers meet, they talk about these things, we all are here discussing, but how are we going to implement all those things? Are we going to have some strategic thinking which way we want to go, and who are those on the ground level in India and Australia who will drive these activities? And here, in my view, comes the role, because I work on local governments and subnational state level governments, and I think it becomes very important that state level governments, they become active. And if they don't do much about these things, it will be very difficult to do business in India. And I know because of the situation, what's happening with the bullet train project, in which Japan has invested 12 billion or committed $12 billion, but I know how things are not progressing the way it was supposed to progress. And here comes the role of the national government as well as the state government. So that's my second point. The third point I want to make is that, the understanding of India in Australia and understanding of Australia in India is still very weak. We need to do something about it. We have seen Asian studies being closed or reduced, staff being replaced, all those kinds of things. So we need to think as to how we implement at the grassroots level and at the intellectual level, where students understand, those who are young leaders or upcoming leaders, they need to understand what Australia is all about, what India is all about. Unless we do these things, we can keep producing lots of reports, because Australia has produced reports in the past. I can see Peter Mayer here, my colleague, and together we wrote a paper. We said that, how many papers in the past were produced by the Australian government, DFAT, but nothing, actually not much came out of those things. And now we have seen another report by Mr. Varghese. We will see Mr. Wadhwa's report soon. So we really need to think about the ground level reality and how to go about these things. I think I will stop there, and then we can have some discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Jain, for your very thought-provoking, I think, and remarks. And I think you have made a very, I think, pertinent point towards the end, where you have been saying that it is very important for working on enhancing the understanding of India and Australia and vice versa. And that remains one of the key challenges. And I'm sure everyone who's attending the zoominar today has a role to play here in terms of talking about the relationship, writing pieces, developing collaborations. We have heard how Melissa has been doing it over the years at various levels, through academics, through diplomats, and through students. And we also have seen over the years, the partnership that are being signed in the education space between Jindal Global University and a whole lot of universities here in UQ itself, Griffith University, all the universities and Geo group of 8 universities have got a very, very vibrant presence in India at the moment. So I think that needs to go up. And I think above everything else, I think we need Australia to start thinking in terms of reinventing that old 3 C's paradigm, which is Commonwealth, curry, and cricket. And I think bringing in a new 3C paradigm that is creating or nurturing a constituency of country champions. And I think the effort that the Australian government is putting in terms of introducing more fellowships under the new Colombo plan and a whole lot of other fellowships which are being announced. And I think this is a very good start in terms of nurturing the next generation of people in Australia, experts in Australia who understand India better and who are able to inform policy matters in the years to come. And I think,
Ashutosh, I also want to congratulate you on your work, and that is very, very important.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Jain. It's an honor that you all could come and talk about it. So while we are waiting for questions to come, I'll quickly throw a couple of things on the table for our panelists to answer. Ambassador Wadhwa, a quick one. I was looking, and I was actually doing a Control F search on the joint statement and looking for the word Malabar, and I did not find it. So I would like to have your inputs on that. So how do you see that for the moment? Yes.
I think that's a very pertinent, observation. And I was myself looking for Malabar, with the word Malabar in the joint statement. But I think it's a natural progression. I don't think we should pay too much of attention to the fact that it's not here. The level of confidence that the two countries now have and the amount of exercises that have happened at a very extensive level, in the recent past, over the past 2 years in particular, I would say that this is bound to happen in the near future. The fact that it's not mentioned there does not take away from the fact that this is something which will come naturally now to both sides. Having signed a logistics agreement, I doubt very much if Australia can be now kept out of an exercise like Malabar.
Mm. Mr. Wadhwa, there's a question from Mr. Virendra. He's asking, what initiatives are being taken to support small and medium enterprises do business with India?
Well, I think there is a specific reference which I saw in the joint statement. There's a whole paragraph on small and medium enterprises and how they should be brought into the relationship to actually get the business community, the business ties going. As far as India is concerned, and I take up from the point which Jim mentioned, that the Indian economy, composed mostly of SMEs, is actually had a very bad impact of COVID-19, and therefore there's a big package that has been announced, by the government in order to shore up the small and medium enterprises. That's being rolled out now as we speak. So hopefully it should mitigate a lot of effects of COVID-19 on the small and medium enterprises. And they will once again come up to a level where they can actually go out and cooperate in the outside world.
Thank you, Ambassador Wadhwa. And I think there's a question, I think both Melissa and Shaun, if you could unmute yourself, if you could answer. I think this is from a student, Asha, and she's saying, how I'm a student and how do you think I can play a role in strengthening relationship? So I think Melissa and Shaun can answer that. Shaun?
Well, thanks for throwing it over to me, Asha, and thanks for the question, Amishir, as well. As Amishir and others know, there's a lot of fantastic opportunities offered by Australian universities, Indian universities, a number of whom partner with these Australian unis, and also the government through, for example, the New Colombo Plan, which I think we can all agree is a fantastic program which does just that. It promotes people-to-people links. And in effect, it allows not only Australian students, whether or not they're of Indian origin, to embrace, to explore, to understand India and other, Asian trading partners as well, or, many other countries around the world. And to that end, these Australian students come back and they become ambassadors of the bilateral relationship, or whichever bilateral relationship, sort of whichever country they've been to. So that's certainly one way. Through the Centre for India-Australia Studies at OP Jindal Global University, we host students, as you know. We've hosted almost 200 students on short-term programs to learn about India and to experience India. In fact, shout out to a few of you who are on this call today. Thank you for joining us. And clearly, we've had some impact if you still want to learn and engage with India. So I'm very pleased to hear about that. There are international internship opportunities, but equally, there are opportunities on home soil through organizations like, well, Melissa's here, she can talk about AsiaLink and the various branches of that. Through you know, Ashutosh and Jim have spoken about their respective institutions. So as a student or a young Australian, there are plenty of opportunities. It would, of course, be remiss of me not to mention the Australia-India Youth Dialogue as well, which Anil Wadhwa has mentioned earlier, which is a critical part of how young people can be involved in not only talking about the importance of the relationship, but indeed helping shape the relationship. Because if we look at demographics, particularly in an Indian context, you've got more than half of the population who are youth. Under the age of 35, there's my statistics are out of date, but must be 700 million or so people under the age of 35. So the impact of youth should not be understated. And accordingly, as a young Australian or a young Indian, I think we all have an important role to play.
And Melissa, before you answer this, there's one more question to you, that how much has regional stability on the Indo-Pacific formed convergence in the Australia-India ties? Thank you.
I did say that. So starting on the youth side, I agree with Shaun, absolutely. New Colombo Plan, Australia-India Youth Dialogue. I went and spoke at the last one in India when I was there in January, as did Ambassador Wadhwa. And, you know, it's a great group of people. I think you can also do some things on campus, just keeping India and the relationship visible among other students. And, you know, that's important too, that Australians won't necessarily, young Australians won't necessarily see the importance of the relationship unless people point it out to them. And you as an Australian of Indian heritage have the opportunity to do that, to just make India more visible. Responding on that for the younger people, I think, there's also now quite a lot of opportunities at school level to get involved. And I just want to respond a bit to Purnendra's comment on that, you know, understanding of India and Australia needs to be improved. We absolutely agree. So, I mean, AsiaLink, for example, has a bridge program where we twin schools in Australia with schools in the region. We now have 500 Australian schools twinned with schools in the region. They do teacher exchanges, video classrooms, all sorts of activities together, exactly the sort of building of mutual understanding that we want to see. And we welcomed India into that program in the last year. So again, you're seeing that Indian school children meeting and connecting with Australia. In terms of that, what would you say, the sort of convergence of interest? I think that was the way that Ambassador Wadhwa talked it. You know, the interests of Australia and India have rapidly converged in the region. I mean, we are talking now the same language about the Indo-Pacific. Obviously, India is very happy that we call the region the Indo-Pacific, don't have a problem with that. But we are talking the same sort of language about it being an open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. And that's interesting, the way that a few years ago we had quite different language about how we saw the region. And for example, ASEAN had a very different language about how it saw the region. And there's a much greater convergence about that now with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, the way India and Australia are talking about the Indo-Pacific. So I think we have seen that occur.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And I think there's a question for Professor Jain that's from John Bruni. He's saying that, Professor Jain, had Australia-China ties been all right, do you think there would have been so much of bonhomie between Australia and India?
Sorry, say it. I didn't quite catch it.
The John Bruni has asked that now we are talking, he's saying that before China became a problem, Australia's relationship with India was based on our mutual love of cricket and curry. Professor Jain, could you say that had our relations with PRC stayed on track, any real new initiative towards India from Australia would have been accorded a lower priority?
Well, thanks, John, for that question. Look, you know, we cannot disregard the situation. What we are saying in the last couple of weeks and months, the way the whole geopolitical situation has changed, certainly it has got an impact on this particular relationship. We cannot deny that. But I don't see that that has become a driver. The driver is the geopolitical strategic environment. This is not just about China. This is also about the US. And it's also about Europe, for example. You know, all kinds of geostrategic alignments are perhaps redesigned or will be redesigned. And in that context, in this redesigning of the geopolitical context, I think India's relations with Australia and bilateral relationship between these two nations become very, very important. As I mentioned, is it kind of a real politic? And I think yes, a lot of real politic is there in the relationship with the opportunity for business, with the opportunity for grassroots education, all those kinds of things. But certainly geostrategic environment which we are seeing today is a huge driver in my view. And the economic aspects will follow that. But we have seen lots of issues there. You talked about a partnership agreement between Japan, India and Australia, which has come back on the agenda. Again, RCEP is an issue. I know Australia, Japan, they are not very happy about this, but they also understand India's position on RCEP. But that is an issue for sure. So it's a combination, but I can't say straight it's China, but China is a major factor. But we cannot disregard US, Europe, even Russia. So there are lots of geopolitical factors which are driving India-Australia relations.
Thank you, Professor Jain. I must mention there's a comment from Didi Visakha, I think, and she mentioned the importance of introducing Hindi in schools. Thank you so much, Vishakha, for that. And I'm totally in agreement with you. And I have written in the past in the newspapers that Australia needs to up its Asian literacy, and one way to do is to introduce Hindi in school curriculum, because knowing language, look what the magic of saying anything in Hindi. Scott Morrison, who knows a couple of words here and there, and he's dropping it, and the kind of impact it is having. Imagine a whole lot of population speaking fluent Hindi, the kind of magic it will have for bilateral relationship. And I think, I hope DFAT is DFAT. We have some DFAT representatives as well. I hope they are listening. So if there's anyone who wants to comment on the Hindi aspect, apart from that, there's a question from Amit Gupta and Jim, whether you can. Is there any update on the joint CEOs panel? If you want to take that question, Jim. Okay,
I think he's trying to unmute.
Okay. So I'll okay. You okay?
That's it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Look, I think the best answer to that is that we are now in a phase, and we're already starting this, where we have to work with our counterparts in India, be it Invest India, Confederation of Indian Industry, FICCI, our chambers of commerce in India, in Mumbai and Chennai, and over here in Australia with the Business Council and other chambers. And we have to engage in what I would, for want of a better word, arrange marriages between the key businesses and the business opportunities outlined in this very comprehensive joint statement that the Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Morrison have brought out. And that's everything from science, technology and research collaboration, to maritime collaboration, to defense cooperation, to regional and multicultural cooperation, and of course, to your economic cooperation, innovation and entrepreneurship, and agriculture and water resources management. The list goes on with education, tourism. It's a comprehensive document, energy, and then new ones like public administration and governance. So when the joint CEOs, as you're putting it, get together, here is an unrivaled opportunity, but let's not miss the boat, right? We have to use technology. We've learned something from COVID-19, and that is you can use technology when we don't have delegations, mutual delegation from each country. We can communicate a lot about what the business deals are. We can broker them better, and that will make the impact. And at the end of the day, there's a very simple performance indicator. At every quarter, has our trade and investment gone up on each of the sectors, or have it gone down? And if they've gone down, we should take some proactive measures. So I believe we are now at a point where the rubber can hit the road. Both of us are motivated on the urgent need to resuscitate our economies. And the only way you can do that is to motivate business-to-business dealings at all levels, at the senior corporate level, to SMEs and to micro businesses. And I think here is the opportunity. We would like to work with the Government of India, Government of Australia, Austrade, AsiaLink, all the state trade bodies, all the chambers of commerce to make this happen.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very, very much. We have I think we are already reaching, our deadline. I think we have got another 5 to 7 minutes. We'll quickly try to take as many questions as possible. One is from Niranjan Marjani, and Niranjan says, is Australia-India relationship in any way going to impact on India's engagement with ASEAN? My understanding is they both complement each other, but Ambassador Anil, Wadhwa, or Melissa, Shaun, anyone who wants to take this question, please answer. If Australia-India relationship is going to any way impact on India's engagement with ASEAN in North Pacific.
Well, I think that's a very pertinent question, and it's a line which is devoted to the question with us to recognize ASEAN institutions in the past to help in
I think his voice is breaking, Mr. Wadhwa.
The oceans and revolution, pandemic, not only the healthcare sector with ASEAN, and there are areas in which India and Australia work on a bilateral basis with ASEAN because they are also partners with ASEAN. Now, these efforts can be combined together now that we've identified the areas where we can work together, and that will give a greater impact. I believe one other area in which there is now growing convergence is the putting together of efforts in infrastructure in ASEAN. And that goes along with the root part of the state where they are thinking as well.
I think
of course, the Australian focus is more on the Pacific, but at the same time, I think if these efforts are combined, it'll create quite a bit of an impact.
Melissa?
Yeah. Look, I'd just come in by saying that, apart from the occasional freelancing, Australia does also have an ASEAN-centric policy. And so the wording that comes out in the joint statement is that both sides share a commitment to supporting a strong and resilient regional architecture with ASEAN at its centre. So that's a commonality between both countries.
And there's a question from Mr. Ram Mohan from India News here, Ambassador Wadhwa, that what is the impact that India is going to make on as a chair of the executive board of WHO? I think, can you hear me, Ambassador Wadhwa?
Yes, I lost you in between. Could you repeat that question?
The question is, what impact do you think, and I think the question is that how challenging is it for India at this point of time to assume the chairmanship of WHO executive board, and what impact is it going to have?
I think it's a very important juncture in WHO's life, its history. where the whole functioning of the international system is being challenged, and WHO in particular has come under a lot of fire, especially from the United States. And this whole controversy which has arisen because of the policies it adopted vis-a-vis China. So now when we take over the chairmanship, I think there are two main questions. One is, how can WHO work for the common good, and in terms of helping developing countries and those who don't have the resources to come up with a viable and affordable vaccine for COVID-19. Secondly, how it can strengthen its system to work on helping all countries on an equal basis. And third, of course, will be the reform of the institution itself. Now, as we know, in the multilateral system, WHO, along with many other international bodies, has got a system of voluntary contributions, and that will all come under review and questioning as to how much should be allowed to be accepted, so that influences can be avoided. So these are a whole lot of questions, and I think it's a very complex time for WHO and for India.
I think, Jim, did you get any private question? There's one question for you. I think it's basically asking, what is the role for a private sector in the post-COVID recovery? This comes from our fellow who's in Japan, Dr. Jain.
The role of the private sector is absolutely critical for this economic recovery. It is a case of the public and private sector working together. And in fact, one of the strong reforms of both Prime Minister Modi and also here in Australia is in fact the recognition of the role of the private sector for economic recovery, capital investment, risk management. And even when you study this report and you look through some of the areas that we've got to go through in relation to the financing side, when you look at economic cooperation, we can see in here that both countries have decided to raise awareness in terms of Australian investors and superannuation funds of Australia's India infrastructure under their National Investment and Infrastructure Fund. So I think this is actually very encouraging that both the governments of India and the governments of Australia recognise the role of the private sector, also in relation to the issues of taxation, of offshore income of Indian firms, through the use of the India-Australia double taxation avoidance agreement, and sought clearly the resolution of this issue. And there are other reforms that go with it in terms of ease of doing business in India, and also the ease of doing business in Australia. It's a two-way street. And I think here, to encourage the private sector to invest at all levels, at medium, high, and the very high level particularly, today Adani put $1 billion contract, $1 billion contract in Queensland. Now, regardless of the politics surrounding the coal industry, that is a very important revenue earner for Australia. And we will see that in other areas. So the private sector needs to be supported. It needs to be given the encouragement, the flexibility to do the deals that make a difference and resuscitate the economies of India and Australia.
Thank you, Jim. And there's a question from Cosmos. Basically, it is asking that there's so much of talk about the virtual summit, so many documents have been signed, but asking about the momentum and response from here on. Do you think the bilateral relationship, the strategic partnership has the legs to take all that is happening at all the documents that we are signing to some meaningful destination? So anyone can take that. And quickly, there's a comment from Robert, who's written in Hindi actually. Hindi ko janna bahut zaruri hai, which is knowing Hindi is extremely important. Thank you so much, Robert. I absolutely agree with you. And so anyone who wants to take that question, Ambassador Wadhwa, on does this historic high have the legs to go on in the long run?
I think it's a very apt question, absolutely spot on, because we've seen many summits come and go, but what is important is how we follow up
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd come in. I think this is a great question to finish on. You know, what will be the
Melissa.
long-term effects? I think it's going to be mixed. On areas where we already have a lot happening and we have a lot of momentum, I think those will continue. On the areas that have traditionally been hard, I suspect they'll continue to be hard. So I don't expect that, you know, that CECA, for example, will rush ahead and we'll have a free trade agreement straight away. That those barriers that were there are still there. What I think this does is give momentum to the relationship. It says, and I think it was a very good phrase, that, you know, it shows that we've put each other at the centre of our diplomatic maps, and with that momentum, then you can move forward in a whole range of areas.
Thank you very much. Jim. Jim.
I was going to say that I think this has the potential for longevity because it's an agreement born in the darkest of economic adversity with COVID-19 in both countries. This has never, ever happened before. And so both countries can see opportunities to resuscitate their economies. That is a very powerful force. And for at least 2 years, we're going to be really battling to resuscitate our economies. And so therefore, India, for the first time in my view, has an unrivaled opportunity with Australia and vice versa to make this relationship really work on the economic and business front.
Thank you so much, Jim. Professor Jain, yes.
Can I just bring one point here? You know, if you look at the two-way trade between Australia and India, Australia exports 3 times more than it imports from India. And that has created a huge trade imbalance. And we know what happens between nations when trade imbalance keeps creeping up. So my question, particularly to Jim Varghese, is how, you know, where India can export, what are the areas where India can export to Australia? Because we are just talking about what Australia can sell to India. There are lots of things we can sell to India. We are selling education, we are selling coal and all other stuff. But what can we import from India to make this trade look like more balanced? And without that, I think economic relationship is not going to progress. So I don't know how. Would you like to respond, Jim?
Yeah, sure. I'll answer that. Actually, it's a good question because we had a Make in India webinar with FICCI and Invest India, and we had a very good successful case study there of MedSurg, which is a Victorian company that is manufacturing health products in India and bringing them to Australia. Now that is how you will get this problem. And when you look at this agreement, it says under enhancing science and technology that both countries will work through multi-regional and plurilateral mechanisms to strengthen and diversify supply chains for critical health technology and other goods and services. Now that describes pretty much what the import side of this is, right? So we will, in my view, we will increase our exports as Peter Varghese has channeled in his report to 2035 to 45 billion. And we will also move to increase our imports from 5 billion in 2018 to a much, much higher figure, probably, you know, I'd like to see 5 times or more that figure. And it'll be done through the supply chain. The supply chain in pharmaceuticals, you look at health alone, but you look at other areas of our economy. Now, I don't want to go into the China, India, but the reality is this. We have been too dependent on the manufacturing side in China. And let's be brutally honest about it. And that's not just Australia, it's other countries. We have an opportunity to have an alternative place to do the manufacturing, advanced and otherwise, in a range of areas, bring them to the supply chain, and then you'll have a very healthy balance between exports and imports.
I think we have gone way past our pre-scheduled time, and I think it speaks of the quality of discussion that we have had today. and questions and comments are coming. So, but unfortunately, I'll have to bring the shutters down here and invite Shaun, if you could kindly unmute yourself at your end. And
Perfect.
yes, okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's my profound pleasure now to invite Mr. Shaun Starr. Shaun is an associate professor and associate dean and executive director of the Center for India-Australia Studies at OP Jindal Global University in India. So he's the director of the institute, which forms that third stream in the Triveni Dialogue Series. And Shaun is, I must say, he's a local now in India. He has been there since 2010. And and he has his own advisory practice. Shaun has advised numerous organizations with their entry and expansion into India, and advises a number of clients in the field of sports law, and also advises a number of sporting federations, including Afghanistan Cricket Board. He's a qualified lawyer, and he was named as 30 people to watch in the business of law in Asia. And he teaches sports law and governance at Jindal Global University. He's worked as a senior operation manager at the Indian Premier League, which organizes cricket in India. He published a book entitled Australia in India, a comparative overview of the law and legal practices. He's also the co-founder and chair of the Australia-India Youth Dialogue, which again pertains to the question that have been asked today: how can the youth and students play an important role? So here you have Shaun, who leads such a forum. It's my profound pleasure to invite Shaun to kindly give his closing remarks and also to deliver the vote of thanks for our fascinating panelists for this afternoon. Thank you, Shaun.
In the interest of time, I'll be very brief with my closing remarks and thank yous, and thank you all for your attention throughout and your engagement. It's been fascinating. I just wanted to pick up on a few points that almost all of our panelists have said, and they've noted that apart from the substantive outcomes, and there are a few from this summit, that the symbolism and significance is equally, if not more important. And I just wanted to, and even some of our questions referred to how sustainable is this, will we keep up with the momentum? And I wanted to remake the point that this momentum, I believe, has been building over a period of time. And that this virtual summit was a first. This was the first virtual prime ministerial summit that Prime Minister Modi has been involved in. I think that's significant. Even more significant, I think, is that, let's rewind the clock a little bit. In 2014, Prime Minister Abbott's visit to India was the first official prime ministerial visit and delegation during Prime Minister Modi's tenure as Prime Minister. So that was significant. And shortly after that, Prime Minister Modi came to Australia that same year. And that was the first time an Indian Prime Minister came to Australia in 28 years. And I find that remarkable. And we're talking about symbolism, we're talking about significance. And this, to me, is symbolizing that this momentum is growing. We're signaling to the types of stakeholders that Jim was just mentioning, the institutions, the businesses, that this is a significant and important relationship, and it is growing. Even more recently, the first visit of a president of India just at the end of 2018, and the list kind of goes on. There's a lot of firsts, despite this being a very long and enduring relationship. There's been a lot of firsts and a lot of momentum building. And I think that's significant in terms of symbolism. So in terms of that summing up point, I think that was, apart from the substantive comments that were made, and they were very insightful, I think one of the common threads was the significance and symbolism of some of these things. I mean, a virtual summit is just that. It's a one-off summit, but it is symbolic. It symbolizes that Australia and India are at the forefront of our bilateral relationships in the scheme of things, and that we are serious about it. And now it's up to other stakeholders, like businesses, like youth we've talked about, these new Colombo Plan students who are returning to be ambassadors of the relationship and continue to build people-to-people links. So I thank our panelists, each and every one of you, for your comments, to Ashutosh for kindly hosting and for bringing Jim and myself together, and we will continue to work together as three institutions to host a series of these dialogues, and we hope that you'll continue to come and be engaged. We'll continue to invite you to these. That's to our audience. So the AIBC, the IA, EA, and the CIS. Those acronyms can be a bit of tongue twisters, but we, as a sort of collaborative community, in the spirit of collaboration, which is a big part of what we're talking about, want to do our bit in bringing people in Australia and India together to talk about these very important issues. While this is one example of that, another example is on the 12th. So just a week from today, there's going to be another one of these webinars with Matthew Hayden. Of course, you'll know him from, various cricketing matches. Dr. Sarah Kelly from the University of Queensland, Professor Jack Anderson from the University of Melbourne, and we'll also have Dale Sheehan, who's a sports integrity expert. And the theme of that is going to be sports integrity in the Australia-India relationship and its broader impact. So that promises to be a bit more of a niche conversation, but a very important one as well. I, of course, wanted to apart from thanking the institutions who have hosted this and our panelists, extend a thank you to AI Media and those involved in getting the closed captions and the text throughout this. If you've been following, it's been very generous of you to support us through that. And for also hosting us online. We're looking forward to, for those who have missed today or want to re-watch parts of today, to see a recording of this afterwards as well. So a big thank you to all of you who made this possible and who will continue to make our further webinars and collaborations possible as well. And again, thank you for your engagement and for bearing with us through some of the teething technological issues. I think despite some of those issues, there's been some really insightful, open and frank comments made about the relationship, where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. So in that spirit, we look forward to seeing you again to talk about different aspects of the relationship in future webinars. So thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, Shaun, and also thank you to Kritika for seeing us through. We have been trying to work around the mute and unmute challenge that we have been facing. So thank you, Kritika, again for working with us, and hopefully we'll iron out some of the glitches, but that's part and parcel of the new age we all live in. Thank you very, very much, Kritika.
No worries, thanks.
So thank you all once again, and look forward to engaging you very soon in the future. Have a very good night and very good afternoon in India, Ambassador Wadhwa. Jim, thank you. Professor Jain, thank you. Melissa, thank you. Shaun, thank you. And thank you, everyone.